Hello, welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Legislative Update. I'm David Blackmon, your host, with Jason Modglin, the president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. Jason, how's everything going today?
Well, good. It's great to be back with you, David. Glad you're back from vacation, and
Yeah.
it's a beautiful day in Austin. We had crazy storms blow through last night, as you did as well. But it's bright and sunny, and looking forward to a nice weekend.
Yeah, all our patio furniture ended up in the swimming pool last night. We had winds
Oh
blowing 70 miles an hour up there. It's crazy. At
no.
least we didn't have a tornado like they did, I guess, in Mesquite. Apparently, there was a little tornado that luckily didn't do a lot of damage or hurt anybody, which is nice.
We had oak pollen and hail. That was about as bad as we got, and so they were both pretty miserable last night. But
Yeah.
it's a pretty day today.
Holy cow, that oak pollen can be a killer, man. Well, let's talk about our favorite subject, the Texas legislature, which is in what is this, eighth week? Eighth week of the
Yes,
session already, right?
absolutely. We're under 100 days remaining, and so that's
Yeah.
always a nice place to be. And really, they're starting to get going, get moving. As we've talked about before, the Constitution limits how much work they can do in the early period. The governor a few weeks ago said, "No, no, no, you can start work on these 7 items." About all they've really focused on has been budget. And so both the House and Senate budget committees have been hard at work, meeting regularly and often. 8 a.m. starts to many of these meetings, and then late into the evening. And so that process is about to wrap up in the committees, and then they'll be bringing the bills to their respective floors of the chamber for full approval.
Well, you did some testifying related to the budget last week, didn't you?
I did. So on Monday, I testified to the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Articles 6, 7, and 8. And that's where the Railroad Commission is, TCEQ, the Public Utility Commission, TxDOT, some of those fun agencies. Chairman Armando Wally, he's a Democrat out of Houston, has been the chairman for that article for the past several sessions now, and really does a fantastic job. Good oil and gas Democrat. And so we've had a phenomenal time working with him. I was there advocating for the Railroad Commission, properly funding that agency. As you know, and we've advocated this for a long time, a robust and well-funded regulator is kind of our best defense against
Yeah.
federal intervention. When they see things like the Barnett, and you recall at that time when EPA thought the Railroad Commission wasn't doing enough for shale development, they decided to step in to the
Right.
shoes of the regulator and go after Range Resources. Thankfully, the EPA lost in state and federal court, and but it was also a wake-up call to the legislatures. Hey, you really need to invest in our state regulators, not only the Railroad Commission, but also TCEQ. And so I was there advocating for the Railroad Commission. There's a couple items that were not funded in the base budget that I was advocating for. You may remember PHMSA, one of our regular federal regulators that we deal with at Pipeline and Hazardous Safety Materials Administration out of the Department of Transportation. They are always finding new ways to protect the public and adopting new regulations on pipelines. And while that's traditionally been your bigger steel lines, they're now into gathering lines. And so they have a full suite of regulations related to gathering lines.
How have they
Um,
gotten legal nexus to do that since they don't cross state lines? Under
yeah,
what part of the law are they able to do that?
Largely safety. There's
Hmm.
been a number of really terrible tragedies
Yeah.
where you've had gathering lines on lease. You have a surface owner that is either unaware or negligent, and they decide to develop the surface on top of gathering line facilities. Yeah. And so we've had some real tragedies in Texas, but also around the country. And so PHMSA several years ago, when I was still at the Railroad Commission, adopted a policy of mapping, registration, and then of incident command or incident reporting. And that was a good first step, both for operators and state regulators. But now, as of this May, they have a requirement for regular inspections, similar to what we have with all other pipelines in the state, of both the operator, but also the regulator, regularly walking those lines and attesting that operations are performing as expected. And so that's a new burden for the agency. As you can imagine, they're already over 480,000 miles of pipe in the state. And gathering lines are estimated to be about 100,000 miles of pipe. So growing their jurisdiction pretty substantially by 20%. And so they've estimated that they need approximately 70 new pipeline inspectors.
I can totally believe that.
We've gotten to our highest number of pipeline inspectors ever at the Railroad Commission, and now we essentially need to increase it by 50%. And so they've asked for that. I think hopefully appropriators will acquiesce to that request. That's certainly what we were asking them to do on Monday. A couple of other things.
Wait, before you go on, I want to tell a story about that.
Please do.
Because I'm old. I've got an old-time story about that. My first job out of college was with Coastal States in Houston. And, of course, it was right after they'd had to spin off the Lavaca Gathering Company as a result of the court order and create Valero, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, they were involved in litigation. And part of the basis for the litigation was the fact that there had been an incident related to a gathering system that Lavaca had managed. And the plaintiff was part of the plaintiff's claim was based on the fact that Lavaca Gathering Company couldn't even tell them where the pipeline, the gathering system lines were located. Now, this was 43 years ago. So, you know, hopefully that situation doesn't exist anymore. But you talk about there being 100,000 miles of gathering system pipe in the state. And, you know, most of it's newer vintage than that. And, you know, there's good maps. But back in the old days, this was a real big time problem when companies didn't even know themselves where their own gathering lines were located. So anyway, okay, I'll stop.
Absolutely. No, it's a major challenge. As you know, we have the Call Before You Dig campaign in Texas, and that's really nationwide. And so those folks do a phenomenal job, because sometimes there either is pipe in the ground that's actively being utilized, or there's those legacy pipes in the ground that unfortunately have not been hauled off and scrapped. And so both those dual challenges. And so that's a key part that the Railroad Commission was asking for. They're also asking for a little bit of money for their oil and gas technical permitting division, of which has been a phenomenal resource, not only for operators, but for legislators and the general public on some of the new initiatives. We've talked in the past about Rule 8 and that ongoing effort to update the waste rules at the Railroad Commission. This same division was also critical to adopting the weatherization rules from Winter Storm Uri. And they're really focused on water recycling and the potential growth area there for utilizing produced water for alternatives outside of oil and gas use. And so it's kind of a niche division at the Railroad Commission. And so they've gone to ask for appropriations there. And then the third and final one that I'll just touch on is communications. Both the Public Utility Commission and the Railroad Commission have launched offices of public engagement. And this was really a key part after Uri of all state government needs to do a better job of communicating with the public. Thankfully, we've got 3 statewide elected officials that do that quite a bit, those 3 railroad commissioners. But both the agency and just some of the stats would be helpful in getting out to the public general energy education information. How many wells do we have in the state of Texas? What's our daily production numbers? Where does that potentially go? How much flows into Mexico? How much flows into Europe? So that we can keep our economy humming and moving. And so that's a request that the commission has put forth as well as the Public Utility Commission. So all in all, a good day. It was about 8+ hours sitting there in House Appropriations, waiting to speak, and I got to speak thankfully before 5 o'clock. So that was a nice thing by Chairman Wally. But
yeah, and 8 hours doing that really isn't all that long a day, is it? I mean, I'm sure you've had much longer days than that. I know I did.
Yes, it's. You never want to stay late in February, and so that was one of the last days in February, and I was happy to get out of the Capitol by 5.
Well, next week is Energy Week in the Capitol, when all the associations and a lot of the companies send people to Austin to showcase and talk about what Energy Week is and how it's all put together.
Yeah, so this year, Texas Energy Day is going to be on March 7th, but there's festivities and activities kind of Monday through Wednesday. Tuesday's really the big day. We've got a number of speakers coming to talk to all of the associations, groups that are coming into town. Lieutenant Governor Patrick, Speaker Phelan, both of our Chairman Christy Craddock's coming, and then both of our committees of jurisdiction. So Chairman Craig Goldman out of the Fort Worth area for House Energy Resources, Senator Brian Birdwell out of Senate Natural Resources is coming over to talk to us, and then we unleash all of the company personnel and association personnel onto the Capitol. So I think we've got estimates of about 500 people coming in this year. And they'll go hit offices and say hello. We've got little swag bags for each office talking about oil and gas. The Alliance is actually handing out a little book, Goodnight Drilling Rig. So there's lots of fun education material out there. And this was a book written by a Fort Worth author and actually operator. And so we're happy to share that with folks at the Capitol.
Is it a children's book?
It's a children's book, yeah, similar to Goodnight Moon, and it does a fantastic job saying goodnight to the drilling rig and goodnight to the pumper and goodnight to the compressor and pipeline, and it's a very cute story written by a great author there out of Fort Worth and good family. So and a portion of the proceeds of the book go to Oilfield Helping Hands, a great charity that looks after oil field workers and their families that are injured on the job. And so
fantastic,
really nice of Kyle Wagner to have
the Wagner family
go to that charity. So really happy to support them. But we'll hear from lots of different legislators. We'll go visit with legislators, and then ultimately, I think, enjoy a barbecue lunch or something on the Capitol lawn. So it'll be a fun day at the Texas Capitol, and looking like pretty good weather. So pretty excited about that.
Well, that'll be a relief, won't it? You never want to do that in the rain. Or a freezing rain. So right. One of the big things that happened this week, and it just seems like every session we've got a fight between the House and the Senate on something, and now it looks like property tax relief is going to be one of several things they're going to fight about. Property tax, people don't understand how significant that question is to the oil and gas business, and how you do property tax reform can have actually a significant impact on oil and gas producers and pipeline companies and everybody involved. And I guess Speaker Phelan and Lieutenant Governor Patrick are kind of not on the same page at how to go about all that. What are they fighting over?
That's right. That's right. Well, yeah, as you know, the oil and gas industry pays a lot of money in property taxes,
Yeah,
not only on all facilities and refineries and pipelines, but then mineral owners pay on basically the interest in the ground,
yeah,
those mineral interest, not necessarily on what is produced, because that's severance taxes, but the potential for that reservoir to be productive. And so people pay a lot in property taxes. We are unfortunately a high property tax state, but that's because we don't have an income tax in this state. And so we pay for local government with property taxes. Yes, we have a bit of a disagreement between the two chambers. As you know, the governor kind of set the table to say, I want at least half of the budget surplus to go towards property tax relief. And so 33 billion or so was the estimate from Comptroller Hager on the surplus. And so that'd be about 16, 17 billion dedicated to property tax relief, but left the details, as he should, to the legislature to figure out kind of how to get that money back to Texas property owners. And so you've got in the Senate an idea to continue increasing the homestead exemption.
yeah.
Every homeowner in Texas, hopefully, has a homestead exemption in place. That this limits your appraisal growth. It also allows for some amount of a discount and ultimately how much you pay in property taxes. And so currently the homestead exemption is $40,000, where if you, and it's hard to find these, but there are some of these homes in Texas that are $40,000 or less. You would not pay anything in property taxes. If you've got, say, $100,000 home, you would deduct $40,000 from the value of that home and only pay property taxes on the $60,000. The Senate wants to raise it to $75,000 homestead exemption, which would be phenomenal when you're looking at about a 3% property tax rate in the state. That's a pretty substantial chunk of change for property owners to save. The House, I don't think, is necessarily opposed to that, but really wants to have the appraisal conversation. As I mentioned, when you have a homestead exemption, you have a 10% appraisal cap, meaning I've got that $100,000 home. The only amount that I can increase my appraisal each year is by 10%. So even if it's gangbusters in Fort Worth, I can only go from $100,000 to $110,000 in my taxable value. The House would like to lower that first and foremost to 5%, but they also recognize that we potentially create a challenge where you have a split roll, and the split roll means that you've got commercial property escalating on a never-ending basis. You've got homesteads that are capped and held lower, and so you start to shift the property tax burden away from homeowners and onto businesses. And so the House's proposal is to actually put an appraisal cap on all property, to look at a 5% across the board appraisal cap. This is very similar to what you see in California. So California has a 1% appraisal cap on all property, meaning that whatever you purchased at, whatever you registered that property at, it can only grow at 1% each year until it's sold, refiled based on whatever you sell at. And then that's your new appraised value moving forward. Lots of pluses and minuses in that. If you're a homeowner, and the sooner you buy, the quicker you're saving. And so it's nice if you bought your house several years ago or and you get 20, 30 years down the road, and your neighbor is paying a lot more than you are because they've got a newly purchased home. It's nice for that individual homeowner, it doesn't quite make sense in the grand scheme of things if you've got two seemingly similar properties and they're being appraised very differently, taxed very differently. We have a prohibition on that in the Texas Constitution. Taxation has to be equal and uniform is the term of art, and so I'm putting on an old hat here. I used to do a lot of property tax stuff prior to coming into oil and gas. So you're bringing back some memories here, David. But
yeah, and they're not good ones. Yeah, I understand.
Not good ones. No, yeah, especially right now when everybody's paying their property taxes and they seeing it on a regular basis when they file their taxes, and so it's a challenge. It'll be, I think, a very good debate between the House and Senate. They're going to do something. I mean, the governor will keep them here to make sure that there is property tax relief that moves forward. We talked several weeks ago about the business personal property tax. You've got kind of, unfortunately, they're not on the same page on that either. They've got very different approaches. You've got in the Senate what was articulated by a lieutenant governor, which is a cap. $100,000 and under, you're exempt from paying business personal property taxes. That certainly doesn't help the Exxons of the world that they're going to pay. But for the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, we're going to save a couple $100 each year, not needing to pay for this desk and that picture frame back there and stuff like that. There's small businesses all across the state that get hit with this nuisance tax, which is what it is.
It really is, yeah.
On our desk and chairs. And so the Senate proposed a $100,000 cap on that. The House just went ahead and said, well, let's just get rid of business personal property taxes altogether. And so
okay.
Again, pretty big loggerheads there as to differences, but certainly look forward to the debate and see kind of where they go.
I wonder what the fiscal note would be on that one, getting rid of it.
It would be pretty big. There's no question. Some of these commercial buildings where they've got just tons of computers and desks and teller machines and things of that nature. I mean, it runs up quite a bit. But again, it's kind of a nuisance tax. I mean, you've already paid a sales tax, and you've got to pay just this regular desk fee essentially. And so I certainly agree with doing away with a portion of it, and whether that's $100,000 or $1 million, find a solution there.
Yeah, you talk about nuisance taxes and go back to the property tax on oil and gas and paying it on the value of your reserves in the ground. There was a study done, I guess it's probably been 20 years ago now. I think Texoga, Texas Oil and Gas Association, sponsored it. It might have been Mr. Perryman who did it, but determined that by the time a barrel of oil, an average barrel of oil is actually produced out of the ground, you paid property taxes on it something like 4.5 times before the average barrel comes out of the ground. So I mean, it's a little bit more than a nuisance, and people don't understand. People kind of roll their eyes when oil and gas companies say Texas is a high oil and gas tax state, but that's one of the big reasons why it is a high oil and gas state, because only Texas and I think it's Kansas are the only two states in the country that allow the property tax to be levied on the value of your reserves in the ground. And so it's a big deal for the oil and gas business, anything that happens there.
Yeah. One of the other items, and I don't know if you want to get into, is an effort that was kind of revised in the House. So Chapter 313 used to be a tax code provision that allowed for local governments to negotiate with big projects. This could be a Samsung facility. They're going to put a fab lab in your community. Could be a refinery. Could be a wind farm. Anything that is heavily capital intensive. it allowed for that business to approach the local government and say, if you give me a property tax abatement for a 10-year period, I'll give you a bonus, essentially a signing bonus that can help defray some of your costs, pay for things. But this was a way to basically be a closer for getting projects into your community. Chapter 313 was on the books for quite a while. It actually expired at the end of last year, December 2022. It was not renewed by the legislature last session. There were a variety of reasons for that. One, it's kind of an interesting coalition against Chapter 313. You've got kind of the far right libertarian types, and you've got the far left that think property taxes should be high on businesses. And so kind of both those groups oppose these types of measures. You also had, because it benefited wind to such a degree, and wind, you could argue, is captive. They've got to go to high wind places. They don't really have any choice. What was the point of giving away a property tax abatement to something that's so heavily subsidized by the federal government? But that being said, they were eligible for that program and certainly benefited from it. And so the Senate said, look, we will pass 313, but we don't want wind in it. And that died last session. And so there's today no ability for, let's say, a refinery, if I'm going to do a massive reinvestment, to negotiate with that local government for some amount of abatement for my capital investment. The House, Chairman Todd Hunter, who's the State Affairs Chairman, has introduced House Bill 5. This is a new program. It's not called 313. I hesitate to give you kind of the nomenclature on it right now, but essentially it would do the same thing. It would allow for these extremely capital intensive projects to still come to Texas, negotiate a lower property tax overall bill. And so he's introduced that. Have not seen the Senate with kind of a comparable bill yet, but I would imagine they would be working towards that. It's not something that necessarily directly affects operators and upstream industry, but if you follow that barrel of oil, it goes to a pipeline, and if a pipeline's having a major investment in a community, they certainly want to find a way to lower their property tax obligations. And then that barrel goes to a refinery, and the refinery wants to do the same thing, lower their property tax obligation. So it doesn't necessarily directly affect us, but it does because our customers would be paying more, and that means they're paying us less so that they can pay their property tax bill. And so we get kind of involved in some of those conversations.
Yeah, and you see Representative Hunter sponsoring that bill from Corpus Christi, and you understand what's happening in Corpus Christi with the port and all the economic development down there. I think it's probably kind of important that the local government is able to negotiate with companies to attract that business in there and create all those new jobs. And it's why Corpus Christi's economy has been able to grow so rapidly here over the last half decade. And that, of course, all has to do with oil and gas as well, and the ancillary businesses related to it. So it's all really important stuff, and hopefully something will get done. I came into this thinking we didn't have a lot to talk about this week, and we're already over time. Anything else we should add before we wrap this up and say goodbye until next week?
I don't think so on the Texas front. We eventually have to tackle ESG and where that's going to go this session. Lots of headlines right now, and potentially whenever this podcast comes out, we'll have a veto from President Biden, his first veto on the repeal of the Department of Labor ESG rule, which said that investment brokers have to take into account ESG when advising clients. So those topics are certainly going to be front and center at the Texas Legislature. They really took the lead last session on the first bill in the nation to push back on some of these investment houses that were phasing out oil and gas or being aggressive towards boycotting oil and gas. Texas led on that issue. It's unclear what's next in that phase. We've seen a lot of other states jump out there and do different things, Congress doing different things. So I'd say stay tuned as to how Texas is going to continue that battle.
Yeah, ESG is such a scam. I just wish something effective would really get done to kind of turn that around, because they're not disagreeing necessarily with any of what it's trying to advocate for in terms of what it's supposedly trying to do. It's the way it's been used to discriminate financially against companies that are trying to produce the energy we all need, and that's just not productive for anybody in our economy or society. And so that's a big deal, and hopefully something good will happen on it sooner or later.
Yeah, unfortunately, with that administration change, you remember at the tail end of the Trump administration, the Office of Currency, kind of one of those random bureaucracies in federal government. Yeah. They had launched an investigation into banks and investment houses colluding on blocking investment for oil and gas and other types of investments. And unfortunately, with the administration change, that just fell apart.
Yeah.
But that's exactly the concern, is not necessarily, hey, if I want to invest in Coke instead of Pepsi, who cares,
Right.
But if all of the banks collude, or investment houses say we're going to downgrade certain items, and the best example of this is FTX. FTX had a higher ESG rating than ExxonMobil.
Right.
And FTX doesn't have any governance. They didn't have any social benefit to the world, but they obviously were not producing hydrocarbons. And so therefore they had a higher score than an energy company.
And they were giving a lot of money to politicians from a particular
They were giving a lot
too,
of money, so. and was the largest corporate fraud in world history. So I mean that's case example of just it's great if we're telling our story, and certainly oil and gas companies, both private and publicly traded, have a great story to tell. We don't want to shy away from that. But then if they're actively being discriminated against, that's something that we need the government to weigh in on and block that type of discrimination.
Yeah, government should not be saying collusion's just fine if you're colluding against the oil industry. I mean, that's not something a free society ought to be condoning, and it's just ridiculous. Anything else?
I don't think so. We covered it all.
All right.
So look forward to chatting next week.
Okay, good deal. Well, have a great weekend, and y'all have a great weekend too, and we'll see you next week.